Welcome. We're excited that you're here. I am the lead instructor for the product design program at Flatiron School. And we run a 15, a 20, a 40, and a 60-week product design program. And we teach everything from early discovery and foundational research methodology, interviewing stakeholders and users, and uncovering user needs and behaviors and motivations. We teach that all the way up to final high fidelity visual design. So that's creating interactive prototypes, that's doing usability testing. We work in design systems, we work in building prototypes in code. So we do a little bit of everything at Flatiron School. We teach a lot of design strategy and systemic thinking. So this future scenario work that we do, we teach our students to think in systems and think across disciplines. If you want further information about Flatiron Design School, would really love to engage with you. I'm going to put my contact information up here in just a second. I'm sharing my screen. And you'll see the website. There we go. All right. So if you're interested in more, please engage with me on Twitter. You can email me. But if you go to flatironschool.com product UX UI design course, you can sign up for a session to talk to someone about what's going on there. Right now, we're in our second cohort of students, and all signs point to it being a really amazing, immersive program. Like I said, we've got the live program where students are in there every single day with our instructors and lecturers doing workshops, building prototypes, doing amazing things right now. And then we have the part-time program where you can do it more at your own pace, but it's the same content, the same quality of outcomes as we help you build your portfolio and get roles in design. So if you are interested, or if you know someone that is interested in getting into product design, whether UX or UI or both, please do check out Flatiron School, because I think there's some really, really good stuff going on here. All right. There we go. Okay. So what I'd like to do is recap just a little bit from part one. We did an earlier session about a month and a half ago, 5 weeks or so, where we got into this idea about future scenarios and how they can be useful to product managers, product designers, anyone who is dealing with technology, rapid change, and needs to think at a strategic level in their industry and in their practice. So one thing that we really talked about was this idea of emergence. The idea that, like Tolkien said in the beginning of his book, the tale grew in the telling, meaning he didn't necessarily set out a specific point and target, right, to travel to, right? He sort of grew the tale as he told it. And we talked about how there's a difference between setting an explicit goal that you're trying to attain versus a direction of travel. Okay? Because our tech industry and the work that we do is getting increasingly complex, right? An overwhelming amount of information and decisions and options. Rather than setting goals and then abandoning them along the way, or attaining the goal and finding out it was the wrong goal to begin with, right? Let the tale grow in the telling. So we define a direction of travel instead of setting goals. We also talked about this idea, the Japanese concept of ba, B-A, okay, which is a space where we can come together, just like we're doing tonight over Zoom, or you may do with your coworkers, or whatever it is where you come together with people, whether in person or virtually like tonight. You're inhabiting an information space. It is a space in which meaning can come out. Okay, so by inhabiting this information space together, you can start to explore these different areas, right? And you should be kind of connecting that to what we're talking about with storytelling and future scenarios. What we're doing with future scenarios is trying to inhabit a meaningful, immersive space in which we can move around, right? And we can query these different elements in the scenario and in the story, right? So if you think about your work, whatever it is that you do, and if you think about a particular scenario that may or may not come true, there are going to be all these different elements that are happening in that scenario. And each one, as a team, you can kind of come together and look at those elements, examine those elements, and ask what if? What if this thing occurs? Okay, so meaning arises in an information-rich space, and stories experienced and told together are an example of an immersive and meaningful information-rich space. So in stories, this idea, it's not about giving content, okay? It's not about trying to deliver content like we're doing blog posts or something. It's about generating a context, right? So that's the difference, again, between setting an explicit goal versus a direction that we want to travel. Generating contexts over delivering content. So defining scenario development, and this kind of wraps up our recap. Scenario development is about combining patterns, themes, and trends in order to tell strategic stories. And this is kind of where we left off in part 1. Now with part 2, we want to dive a little bit deeper into, well, why stories? Stories are something that we all grew up with as children, right? Hansel and Gretel, or Robin Hood, or Harry Potter, right? So stories are extremely and intimately familiar to us as humans. So what does that really have to do with our work in technology or in whatever domain that you work in? Why are stories relevant or helpful? Well, number one, they're universal, right? Stories transcend any disciplinary boundaries, just like the complexity of wicked problems do not respect disciplinary boundaries. When we're talking about wicked problems like climate change, world hunger, fake news, right? Information overload, right? Social unrest, political issues, right? It goes across all disciplinary boundaries. Well, stories do as well. And stories have a rallying power, right? Around which a large group of cross-disciplinary people can come together and work, right? So if you think back to why you joined the company that you joined, or why you are in the line of work that you are in, the likelihood is that at some point you told yourself, or you heard a story, right, about the type of work that this company does, or the impact that it might have out in the world, right? So there was a story either that you told about yourself, or that you heard, that you received, right? And then you made choices to move to that line of work, okay? Stories have immense and incredible power, and they're infectious, right? So this is such a good quote. Treating stories as assets is an under-realized idea right now. Stories serve as glue to unify communities. They spread from employee to employee, consumer to consumer, sometimes from employee to consumer or consumer to employee. Stories are much more memorable than statistics or simple anecdotes, and a mechanism that allows communities to grow. Strong stories can be told and retold. They become infectious, okay? Another reason why stories. Complexity is simply outpacing us. We need a way to make sense and to orient ourselves within this complexity. In other words, we need to move from data to knowledge, to wisdom. And stories are one way that I believe can help us get there. Another effect that stories have is that they can untangle harmful associations. Does anyone remember this commercial from Coke? I want to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony from the 70s. Or maybe you heard the song. Is anyone familiar with Coke and the polar bear and Christmas, right? This brand, Coca-Cola, is telling us a story. It is a story that we are to believe about the power of Coca-Cola in our society, right? Coke brings us together. Coke represents Christmas, right? Now, I'm, kind of calling on Coca-Cola as the bad guy, but there's an association there. But looking at the ingredients of Coke, it's a harmful association, ultimately, right? And so with stories, our brains tend to merge these ideas into a single cohesive system. And we no longer have the necessary distinction to make good choices, right, about what we do, what we engage in. All right, so stories can help us untangle these things the same way that they got tangled. And then another reason that we need stories is because they can challenge current assumptions. We always assume and we act like the future is going to look like the present. Okay? We're not good about thinking about second and third order effects. Systems thinking is not something that comes naturally to most people. We tend to not see very far past the first order effects, right? Because after that, there's sort of a fog of war. Things get hazy. So what do we need? We need scenarios. We need stories to forecast and to cast through that fog of war and to challenge, right, these embedded implicit assumptions that a lot of times we, as people in technology, we're not even aware, right? So designers most frequently assume that the unmarked user has access to very powerful privileges, like some of us, US citizenship, English language proficiency, access to super fast broadband internet, smartphones, a normatively abled body, so on, right? Now, as designers, we have tools to challenge our biases and challenge our assumptions, and we put up safeguards, or we try to make sure that we are actually designing for the users that we claim to represent. Right? But there are so many different things, from sample bias to confirmation bias, right? There are all of these things that are so hard to, we don't know what we don't know is often the problem, right? So if we don't know that we don't know it, there's no way to guard against it. So stories give us a tool, again, to poke into those spaces, into the sort of fog of war that we often have around our business or our work. So I want to extend this idea of scenarios into a concept called world building. Okay, and the reason why this is relevant for us in tech and in design particularly is, again, going back to this idea that things are often so complex, right, that sort of linear path through things and setting an explicit goal, a KPI, an OKR, whatever you want to call it, trying to go through that one thing like a straight arrow fails so often. How many times have you set and then abandoned a goal, right? So when we're thinking about world building and storytelling, storytelling has become the art of actually building a world, or if you can think about the Japanese concept of a meaningful, immersive space, an information-rich space. So artists, designers, product managers, whatever, can create compelling environments that cannot be fully explored or exhausted within a single work or even a single medium. So does that remind you of anything? Right? It's no longer just a single story. It's many stories within a greater context or within a world. Okay? So if you've ever worked with user stories or job stories or user scenarios or personas, like all these different terms that we have in human-centered design, have you ever looked to see whether or not these stories hold together in a coherent fashion? Because a lot of times they don't. A lot of times teams, cross-functional teams, will build these user scenarios or user stories very locally, highly contextual to the feature or the or the upgrade or whatever it is being worked on, right? They'll develop a scenario or a story for that. It's very local, highly contextual. Right? But there's not many people strategically looking to see how these stories fit together and if they're coherent, right? And this is how we end up with the spaghetti mess of products, right? And here's another interesting thing about scenarios is that there's a difference between extending the present and challenging the present, okay? What's so interesting about storytelling and scenarios in tech is that they should convey some sort of sociocultural discourse, right? There's a difference between VW saying, here is a concept vehicle for a truck, right? Which is mostly just an extension, a slight extension of what we already have. And Tesla throws something out there, and there's a very obvious conversation to be had around what this signifies about the state of the world that we need a vehicle like this, right? Does everyone remember when this was unveiled? Right, lots of conversation and debate and criticism and but the greater point here is that it created a substantive sociocultural conversation about, well, what is the world that we live in that this is something that we need? It was sort of a shock to the system, and it made you start to think and wonder, well, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for our society, right? It's interesting. It's different. It's not just extending what we already have, okay? It's challenging the status quo. So what are the qualities of a story or a scenario? Well, I've mentioned the idea of coherence, okay? And how we often develop our scenarios and stories in very hyper-local fashions. Okay. And we don't often look to see if our scenarios coherently fit together into a world, much less a world that we might want to live in, right? So pulling from, going back to film and even game design, they often make these things called world maps. And I think this is such an interesting artifact that we in tech and in product design can use to help us hold a coherent narrative together across many products, across many systems, across many features. Okay, so I know the map looks kind of complex and overwhelming, but it's actually very simple, right? There's an origin story, there's a logic point, right? That so for instance, think of what's a good example here? Superman, okay? We're all familiar with Superman. All right, so think of Superman's origin story. There's like a logic point there that sort of holds everything together. And then you have all of these different pockets around which that circles that sort of origin, right? And a coherent scenario or a coherent story lets us see relationships and find missing areas. So it could be tangible things like infrastructure, geography, biology, could be social structure, could be language, identity, landscapes, climate, technology, architecture, like all of these things, they're question containers of a sort. But they all circle around this like common origin. Right? And so you can take these world maps, right, and apply them to your own domain or your own work and say, where does my work extend into, and what areas have we not looked at? Material, social, mental, whatever area it is. And you can start to poke into those spaces, right? And find scenarios within which your product or your service can have some sort of influence or impact. The last session I talked a little bit about Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg and this movie, Minority Report. Minority Report is an incredibly coherent world. Right? This was actually a big strategy that Spielberg had when writing the storyboarding and everything like that. Everything had to make sense, right? Or it breaks the suspension of disbelief of the audience. And scenarios are the same, right? You can't go too wild with your scenarios, right? Because then it doesn't make sense. Why would someone do this? Why would this exist? How did this happen? It doesn't make sense within the world map, right? And that leads to plausibility. Right? The Tesla truck, when it was unveiled, is entirely coherent and plausible given the state of our society right now, right? It pokes us, right, in an interesting way, just like I think the series Black Mirror pokes at us, right? Because it seems plausible. It makes us kind of uncomfortable, but it's plausible, right? It's connected to reality. So if you go too far with your scenarios, then it's no longer helpful to discuss things around, right? And one way I like to think about it is as my audience as reverse archaeologists. Rather than looking into the past, we're looking into the future, whether 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? We might be looking at, my product, my service, whatever domain that we're working in. And we can cast into looking at the values, the beliefs, symbols, modes and methods of production, consumption, and disposal. Okay. But plausibility is an important quality of your scenarios. And the last quality I want to talk about is dissonance. Okay. Again, going back to the Tesla truck, going back to Black Mirror, there is a sense of dissonance, an almost slight uncomfortable feeling that an effective scenario can cause in the audience. So it challenges the legitimacy of the current conditions, right? What if this trend continues, right? What will that mean for our users, right? What if this driver of the trend all of a sudden sees a huge uplift, right? And we sort of skip a couple of levels, right? Then you get the Tesla truck. So it's challenging the status quo, right? It's challenging the legitimacy of current conditions. And then you ask yourself, is this the direction of travel that we want to be in? Right? It's not a goal. We don't want to set those goals, right? We want to orient ourselves within a particular direction of travel, preferable futures, right? All right, so let's look at some patterns that we can use when we're building scenarios. So scenarios don't just come out of our imagination, right? There's a couple of elements there. Most of the time, they're going to come from some type of research. Either your product manager or your designers are doing research. So you've got a knowledge repository that you are building about your users, about your market. So you've got design research, and then you have the signal scanning, and we talked a bit about signal scanning in the first webinar. Signal scanning is simply just a greater awareness, a contextual awareness about what's going on in your industry. So could be blog posts, could be white papers and reports, industry reports, it could be academic studies, it could be social media, right? Like, I mean, some of us are very comfortable, doing analytical analysis on sentiment analysis with Twitter and things like that. So signal scanning can be almost anything, but you're looking for that signal in the noise, right? Trying to find those trends. All right, and then there's always coupled with some sort of agenda. Scenarios are not removed from having an agenda. It could be commercial, could be an ethical, responsible agenda, trying to minimize harm. Could just be experimental. It could be for the purpose of dialogue, discursive agenda. So really it's more about the questions that you can ask with your scenarios. And it could be perspective shifting scenario. What if something that was totally familiar all of a sudden became unfamiliar, right? Like Black Mirror, what if phones, but too much, was I think the quote from the series creator. What if phones, but too much, right? So it flips your perspective on things. And then the last element is what is the time horizon that we're examining, right? Is it in the immediate future, 0 to 3 years, 1 to 5 years, 10 years, 15 years in the future? What's the horizon and the length that we're looking at? So in the last part, we did a trend inventory collectively. We had about 100 people, and we all jumped into Mural, and we looked at these trend inventories for different domains. One was artificial intelligence, one was healthcare, one was climate change. Okay. And we just kind of collectively plotted our certainty about certain things happening. So low certainty, high certainty, and then across a time horizon, a length. And we ran out of time, right? And so that's what tonight was sort of the follow-up to that. So on this trend inventory, on the upper right quadrant, which is the lengthiest time, okay, and the lowest certainty, these are your elements of radical transformation or radical disruption. It's the haziest part in the fog of war, okay? It's the furthest out, but it's also the things that could all of a sudden become accelerated. All of a sudden, Donald Trump gets elected again, and then some shit gets accelerated, right? And you're all of a sudden in this radical transformation or radical disruption area. And for those companies, those designers, and those teams that have thought about these things, they're already going to have a wealth of questions and information because they've been on this sort of direction of travel. And they're not less likely to be disrupted and having to abandon an entire system or product or technology, right? Because these are some things that they have considered. All right, in the lower bottom left quadrant, this is the time horizon that's closest to us. This is the VW truck version, okay? It's the continuation of what we're already doing, of what's familiar to us, okay? So it could be anywhere from 0 to 3 years, roughly, right? If we stay on the trajectory and we keep making the kind of decisions that we've made, these are the likely things that will happen. In the very middle quadrant is where things get interesting, right? Because it could go either way. And so in this middle quadrant is where I think scenarios can be really useful because you start to say, okay, if these things start happening, there are some drivers to these trends. What's driving the trend of homelessness? What's driving the trend of ocean rise? What's driving these different trends, right? And how are we positioned if some of these things happen, if some of these trends continue? And so you see how you're plotting this direction of travel, and you might need to change. You might need to reorient a few times. But you start asking, as a precursor to these scenarios, if trend X comes to pass, what's going to follow? Okay, and you start to plot a path. So what I wanted to do with all of you tonight is, the whole purpose behind this is just to give us more tools to create scenarios and to sort of structure and orient ourselves within, the line of work that you do or the domain that you're in. So I plotted something called an impact wheel. Now, this is something that's companies, I think Shell started using it maybe in the 70s or something like that. Futurists developed this impact wheel. So some of you may be familiar with this, but it's essentially trying to map out the first, second, third X order effects of a particular scenario coming true. Okay, so I just plucked something from the mural board from last session, and one of them was autonomous cars. Okay, so if I work in AI, or if I work in an insurance company, right, or something like that, it would behoove me as a product leader or a product designer to think about what are some of the effects of this scenario coming true, right? So for autonomous cars, one trend, or one effect rather, could be people no longer get driver's licenses. Okay, well, what would be some second order effects? Well, the elderly and the young can now drive. If we have autonomous cars, you don't need driver's licenses. So what's a third order effect? Over the course of maybe 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to find more elderly people are living in cities, right? Because they can drive in cities easier. Another thing was the insurance industry is going to radically have to change, right? Which could end up with restructured financial markets, different incentives, right? So an entire industry has to kind of reorient around these things. So I think these impact wheels are really, really interesting, and it doesn't have to be about something as, huge as AI or autonomous cars. You can do these impact wheels in whatever industry or domain or line of work you're in now. And so that's kind of what I want us to do right now. I'm going to post a link here in the Zoom chat, and it's going to take you to a mural board. And I just want you to, let me post that link. And you're going to do your own impact wheel. So you'll imagine a particular scenario in your domain coming true. Like, so for me, I'm an instructor at Flatiron School. A possible scenario that I could imagine might be, what if 30% of the universities that are in existence shut down? Right, and we see a huge influx of students. Or what if college attendance goes way down and we start to see a big influx of people coming from high school to Flatiron School? Right, these are people that are not don't have a lot of life experience, maybe have never held a job before. How would my work react? How would our courses need to shift or change? Okay, so be thinking of a scenario like that while I get this link posted. And then I want you to plot out those possible first, second, and third order effects. Okay, for some reason, the chat does not seem to be working for me. All right, I'm just going to try to reset this real quick. Okay, now I got it. Weird. All right, good. Make sure everyone can see it. All right, see if you can get into that mural space. Okay, I see a few people popping in, so that's perfect. All right, so I'll share my screen again and just give you a quick orientation here in case you've never used it. All right, so essentially you're just gonna pop open the the left rail sidebar, and you've got some sticky notes, and you can drag a circle. Okay, so as I mentioned, I might say influx of students out of high school. Okay, you can just type directly in there. All right, and then you can grab another sticky note and say, well, what might a first order effect be? Right, and so you would type whatever that effect is. Right? And if you go back to the left rail and click on this icon here that says shapes and connectors, you can drag out a connector and kind of represent that connection there. You'll see little nodes and they'll just snap into place. Okay, and you'll see that they are linked together. Okay, and if I've got my first order effect, I want to think about, well, what are the second order effects? If this effect happens, right, what is the logical consequence of that? And you would just continue to extend until you feel like, you know, you're in, you can't suspend your disbelief anymore, basically, until it's no longer productive to have a dialogue around this idea. Right, so this is my second effect, and I might have several second effects, right, here that are related to the first effect. So I would connect those, connect these. Okay, and usually you're going to have several first order effects. Like those are the easiest to sort of think about, right? They're the most obvious. But it's when you get to those second and third order effects that things get a little interesting, right? And maybe people in your industry haven't thought about this, and maybe that could be a strategic advantage for you to position your company around, or your product, or a new feature, all right? All right, so you can just do this anywhere on the board. There's not too many of us, so I don't need to create spaces or anything. So you can go ahead and start plotting out your impact wheel. And let's just take a couple of minutes. We've got about 15 minutes left. Let's take 10 minutes, and then we will come back the last 5 minutes and kind of look at what you've done. Be really interested to see some of your impact wheels. So just go ahead and start dragging out some sticky notes. While you're doing that, I'm going to answer a question. Lisa asked a really good question. The similarities or differences between world maps and user journeys. Yeah, assume that a map would identify the ecosystem within which a user journey occurs. Yeah, so I have actually seen that done before, Lisa. I have seen a path plotted through a world map in the style of a user journey. So what's interesting is maybe combining the two, right? So a user journey is essentially going, for those who don't know, a user journey map, a product designer might make that so that they could better understand all of the different touch points that users interact with your system, your service, your product, your brand, your company, on and on, right? And there's different touch points. Right? So if you're on, you're trying to get, let's say, cell phone service, right? What are all the different interaction touch points where you might interact with AT&T if they were doing a user journey map, right? Could be their sales center, could be an advertisement on the internet, and then you go and research the price plans, all right? And then you kind of make your choice and you select the phone that you want to do. And then finally, you get it shipped to you. So there's offline touch points like through the mail, and there's online touch points, getting your service set up. What happens when something goes wrong and you can't get the phone set up? Then you have to call support. Support transfers you over to a different system, right? So the idea there with the user journey is you're trying to determine, well, how is the user experiencing our brand or our system? And at what points can we optimize that and make it better, right? And how can we support the user through their journey? Yeah, but the world map really is a more speculative context within which you might have many user journeys, right? So if you're working for a global company like AT&T or something like that, you're likely going to have elements within a lot of those different bubbles in the world map, right? And so within each of those, there may be smaller user journeys that you can think about, right? And you could transform an existing user journey into a desired user journey in that world map, right? How do we want things to actually be? Here's our current state of things. So what's the future state? And that becomes a information-rich right? An information-rich environment that a team could really dig into and get innovative and get creative. That's what I love about the world map so much, is because it really gives you world building to think about. Yeah, good question. Feel free to pop any other questions into the QA. I'm just going to go ahead and do my own here about online education. So I'm just thinking about if Flatiron School did have this influx of high school student enrollment, what would that mean for a product design program? How might we, what would the second order effects of that be in education? So one thing that I can imagine is right, this idea that there's not really been time for these students to learn how to learn, right? And so a problem with that could be much higher attrition for our program, which has another effect of poor ratings in course reports, which is a trusted source for tech boot camps. Okay, might go back and define another first order effect. If all of a sudden there was an influx of high school student enrollments, So that would mean probably no job experience, which has an impact on career services. Right? They're going to need to provide a lot more support. Okay, and then another effect of that would be, well, right, employer confidence goes down. Okay, and there's often overlaps, right, between these effects. And you can start kind of understanding some of the connections between poor course reports, and then what we start to ask ourselves, as curriculum designers, how would we plot our way through this situation? Because we can then turn this into a scenario, right? Because we have a plausible situation, we have coherent structure, right? And we have causal relationships with things, okay? And we have dissonance. So we've got those three elements together, and it can start literally as simply as writing this as like I said, if X happens, then what? Right. So these future scenarios don't have to be huge, complicated things. You just need a diverse team of viewpoints and people to start plotting some of these things together. Right. And then you start poking into these spaces. And then you can bring in. So what happens when you have a lot of these, right? Where do these overlap in the world map? What parts of the world map have we ignored? Right? Okay, here we're looking at at high schools and the state of education. Okay, so what are some of the drivers and trends? So then I would go out and start doing some research, right? If we felt like this was a pretty plausible situation, and I'd start looking at graduation rates, and I would look at high school placement rates at different colleges and things like that, and I can start signal sensing and looking at patterns and trends. So this is just one very small demonstration of how you could start putting together a future scenario that would then start driving some of your strategy. Again, it's not necessarily a particular goal, because if we're not sensing that this is a pattern that might actually happen in the next 0 to 3 years, right, and our confidence is lower that this is going to occur, then we know we're not going to put as many resources towards this, but at least we have thought about it, right? At least we have some sort of orientation in this area. Okay, let's see. So a couple of other people are working on, some scenarios. Self-driving cars more prominent, meaning the older generation is able to get around, giving them more access to healthcare and medicine resources. All of a sudden demand is up for certain resources. Absolutely. If you're positioned in the healthcare market or insurance, life insurance or whatever, these are things that you want to think about. right? And you want to start constructing some stories about what's the desired future that our service or our product should exist in. Okay. This one's looking good. Colleges drop standardized assessments as an admissions requirement. So there's less investment in test prep, get an influx of applicants, meaning new systems of evaluating them, more adoption of open access enrollment. Yeah. Yeah. So if you continue to extend this in a spider web fashion, or a wheel fashion, right? I would be super interested to see a world map for whatever domain you're in. Be interesting how this would connect to those different bubbles. Because with designers doing qualitative research, right, and really thinking about empathy and about human-centered design, right? It's not just causal. It's not just causality and correlation. It's also, well, what's the ethical response to these things? And so I use scenario design to teach future ethics and design ethics, right? And we did a whole workshop today with our students about data ethics. In fact, we modeled a running shoe that had built-in GPS and sensors and all these things, and so we constructed a scenario and around what are the ethical questions we need to ask about a world in which everyone has a GPS in their shoe, and that their shoe is now storing the data. Like, forget the smartphone, you don't even need that. You've got a shoe storing your location and your routes and all of that data and information. So yeah, I think we'll end it here. Thank you all for hanging in there and kind of just, the tale grew in the telling. Essentially, I didn't so much want to set a goal about we've got to do this thing as have a direction of travel. Because I think that this is such an interesting and an underutilized, and underlooked at area of strategy for technology and for companies. So I hope this is something that I can keep developing. Like I said, please, you can follow me on Twitter or email if you want to know more about this, because this is an area where I particularly am trying to write some course curriculum. And if you want to have conversations about it, I would be certainly interested in that. But otherwise, anything else that you want to talk about, design related, product design or product management, product strategy, would love to hear from you. But I hope you all have a good night. Jelani, is there any other announcements or anything we need to mention before we wrap up?
No, that's it. I'll send the recording out, and thank you guys for joining. Have a great night.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.